Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are just about ready to get started with our webinar today. My name is Becky Robinson, and I'm so thrilled today to be here with author Minette Norman. Minette, welcome.
Thank you, Becky. Thanks for doing this on the launch day of the book.
Yes, today is the day. It's the very first day that your book is available to ship out into the world, The Boldly Inclusive Leader. And one of my favorite, this is just such a pretty cover. And I love the way that it coordinates with your background. So folks, as you're coming in today, we hope that you'll take a moment to let us know in the chat where you're calling in from. If you happen to be calling in as part of your professional development, we would love to know what organization you're representing so that we can give you a shout out. We're always happy to see our international audience as well. So be sure to let us know geographically where you are, also what organization you're representing. And I want to let you know that it's important to us to fuel an inclusive community here. And so in the event that you could benefit from the closed captioning opportunity, you'll find that in the bottom of your Zoom panel. And we welcome you to turn those captions on so that you can get the best possible value from today's event. A few other notes: we are recording. We will make the recording available to you after this event in case you'd like to share it with your friends and colleagues. So I'm noticing that the chat is quite busy. So welcome in Canada, in Kansas, in Pennsylvania. Hi to Gary, who's always with us from Orange, California. We've got McKinney, Texas. Caroline is calling in from Germany. Welcome to you. Looks like we've got Oakland, DC, California, someone calling in from Trinidad, someone from Nova Scotia, someone from England, someone from Nigeria. So it looks like we have an international audience today, which is super exciting. So before we introduce Minette to you formally, we want to take a moment to get to know those of you who have joined today. And we have a poll that we'd like to get your feedback on. I'm going to launch the poll. We would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are in your career. So are you someone who is leading in a corporate environment? Are you someone who's leading in a government setting? Perhaps you're leading in a nonprofit, in education. Potentially you could be an individual contributor, a coach or consultant, or a student. We would love to hear from you, and I'll give you a few moments to answer. So what I'm seeing so far, Minette, is that we have a wide range of folks. By the way, if you are not represented by the choices that we gave you, please feel free to let us know in the chat, something that would more adequately represent where you are in your career. So we want to encourage you to use the chat throughout today's event. It looks like we've got someone who's leading in a corporate environment, consulting engineering. So thank you for sharing that detail with us, Jamie. All right, so I'm going to give you just a couple of more seconds if you'd like to answer the poll, and then I'll show you the results. As I mentioned, we do have a wide range of people represented on today's call. We have some corporate folks, we have some government folks, some nonprofit, some individual contributors, and some coach consultants. So thanks to you who have taken the time to share your career background with us. And I'm excited to get your feedback throughout today's event as we talk about Minette's new book. So for those of you who may not have met Minette before, Minette is an author, she's a speaker, and a leadership consultant, and she previously spent decades leading global technology teams in the software industry. If you happen to have read the book, you're going to know that the book is full of amazing stories from Minette's corporate career. And it's among my favorite things about this book because you really get insights into real life situations and the ways that people can boldly lead to include others in those situations. So Minette is a keynote speaker on topics of inclusion leadership, inclusive leadership, psychological safety, collaborative teams, and empathy. And she's also the author of a book that was released earlier this year. You can see it right behind Minette and right behind me, the Psychological Safety Playbook, and her co-author is Caroline Helbig. So Minette holds degrees in drama and French, and I have just loved getting to know you, Minette, and I can't wait for us to dive in and talk about your book. So we were talking before the webinar began about the title, The Boldly Inclusive Leader. And I know that you are working on this book for quite some time. So I'm curious to hear, Minette, at what moment in your life and career did you decide that you had an important message about inclusive leadership that you wanted to share with the world?
Thanks for the question, Becky. I was thinking about this book while I was still in the corporate world. So that goes back at least 4 years, but probably thinking about it even 5 or more years ago. And the reason is that, I was in the corporate world in software for 30 years. And 20 of those years, I was managing teams. And I started out managing a small team, and I ended up managing over 1,000 people. And in that time, I did not have many role models for great leadership. And I didn't get a lot of training. I mean, there was training over the years, but it was really hit or miss. And I realized, like, we do not prepare people to lead other humans. We just don't. And it's honestly the most important job in the world. I mean, when you manage even a small team, you are really setting the tone for their experience at work. You are impacting their well-being, their mental health, and their ability to do great work. And so the more I progressed and the more I led really large teams, really diverse teams, multicultural, international teams, what I realized is that I have learned a ton over the years, and much of it I have learned through watching people, emulating the behavior I liked, and more often not emulating some really bad behavior I saw in leadership, and realizing, like, we should learn this earlier in our careers. I mean, we should learn that some of these lessons the first time we manage people. And even if you're in the C-suite and have been for many years, there's still much we can all learn. So I decided to take everything that I had learned, and I had done so much reading and so many classes and so much introspection. And I thought, I have things that I can share, and I think it's really important to get this into the world. So I started working on an outline in 2019. And I thought I was ready to write the book. I mean, I had the outline, I was ready to go. And then so many things happened that made me realize I wasn't ready. Like, first of all, I left my job, and I didn't leave under the best circumstances. So I had to really do a lot of thinking about what's important to me. And I learned so much over the past couple of years of actually being out of the corporate world and now being a consultant to other leaders. And I felt like, okay, now I'm really ready to write the book.
Hmm. Well, one of the things that I think is amazing about the book, as I mentioned when I was introducing you, is the way that you have brought in so many of the lessons that you learned as you were leading across the decades. I'm curious about how easy or difficult it was for you to share those real life stories. And, to be clear, you don't look good in all the stories.
Well,
So,
yeah, exactly. I felt like, first of all, I felt it was really important that I be honest in this book and that I not paint myself as like the perfect leader, because above all, there are no perfect leaders. And one of the messages of my book is that we're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's part of being human. And that's actually okay. And we, if we can learn from those mistakes, and even if we can share those learnings with others, then we will be stronger leaders, and people will respect us more, showing that we're human, that we are not invulnerable. And so to me, it was important to share them. Some of them do make me uncomfortable. And there were some I was a little nervous about sharing, because there are other people in the stories. And I don't identify most of the people unless I've gotten permission from them, but most of them are anonymous. But I also knew that many of the people would recognize one another. They'd recognize themselves in the stories. And so one of my early readers is on page 33. And he said he read, he's not named, but he read the book, and he said, I just found myself on page 33. And I was like, okay, how's he going to feel about that? But of course, he's great. He's totally bought into also what he learned from our experiences of working together. So there was definitely trepidation. And, even to this day, I still have some trepidation. I talk about not only myself, but about other leaders, and not all of them come off looking great, but I think we can all learn from those stories. And that's why I shared them. I truly believe that we learn through stories, and we connect with others through stories, not through data and not through facts. And so that's why every single chapter includes stories from my own experience in the work world.
well, and we were talking about that a little bit before the call. Every year there are lots of leadership books that are written. There are many books about inclusion and about inclusive leadership. But I think what is so special about this book is the stories. And you're the only one who could have written this book. So I'm cheering you on and celebrating your bravery and courage and sharing those real life situations that you found yourself in. Um, so before we dive into the planned second question, you and I were talking about how really this book, even though it's a book about inclusive leadership, it's really about modern leadership and what leaders need to be able to do to live in the world that we're currently in. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit more on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, because I do want to touch on it. And, as we were speaking before the webinar started, I started working on this book in 2019. And it was actually really, in some ways, early days for talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, we were already working on it, but it wasn't so much in the just common gestalt, I would say, of the workplace. And then 2020 happened, and George Floyd's murder really brought DEI to the forefront. And no company, no organization, certainly in the US, could ignore topics about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's, kind of taken us through today. And now we're actually seeing a bit of a backlash against DEI, and like people are tired of talking about it. There was the Supreme Court decision against affirmative action, and companies are now thinking about, do we need to dial back on DEI? DEI professionals are losing their jobs. So there's a little bit, that's very sad to me. And I think we can't take our foot off the gas on focusing on DEI. But what I have realized in trying to reframe who I am as a leadership consultant and speaker is not to pigeon myself into the DEI realm, because, as you said, really what I write about is great leadership. Really what I write about is how to be a human leader for today's workforce in the century we're living in, because the old models of leadership no longer work. And if you took out the word inclusion, this would still be a really, I think, an important book for everybody, because it's about how to lead teams of humans for them to do their best work, to bring out all the ideas, to innovate, to perform, to have highly motivated, engaged, and healthy employees. And so, yeah, it's not just about inclusion. Inclusion is woven through the book, because I think that's so important. But I think inclusion really is just about creating great workplaces and being great leaders.
Yeah, I agree. And it's through every single page of the book of, really thinking about how we can show up in ways that bring out the best in our teams. So let's talk about how we as leaders can set the tone for including people fully in our organizations. So what do you mean by that? And why is it the leader's responsibility?
Well, I really believe, and I've seen this so much, that leaders do set the tone, and they often set the tone very unconsciously. And so what I advocate for is being very conscious about the tone we're setting in our organizations. And what I mean by that is, you get up, for example, as a leader, you may be the CEO, you may be a VP, you may just be an individual manager, and you say, ask me anything. I'm open to your questions, I'm open to your ideas. And you get up there, and then someone asks you a question you don't like, and you shut them down. So what have you just done then? You have just set the tone that you didn't really mean it when you said, ask me anything, or that I'm open to your ideas. That's one thing. But another way, I mean, setting the tone is, who do you listen to and who do you ignore? This is really important, because I witnessed this a lot, like just sitting in meetings myself when I was in a leadership position. There were people who got the leader's attention all the time when they opened their mouths. And there were people who got ignored and who got talked over or who got interrupted. And I mean, I was the person sometimes, like I would get interrupted or I would get ignored. And the leader didn't say, hey, Minette just got interrupted here, let's hear her out. They just moved on to the next person, the person that they really wanted to listen to. And so by setting the tone, what I mean is, you as a leader at any level need to be aware of, who are you surrounded with? And are you favoring some people? Are you biased? Because we're all biased. And if you're biased, you need to put methods in place to overcome those biases. Like, I don't really like this person, or this person rubs me the wrong way, but they're in my team, right? I need to find a way to be open to their viewpoint as well, even if I don't particularly connect with them. And,
Mhm.
that thing about all of us as humans is that we are drawn to the people who are most like us. And leaders are no exception, right? We like the people who are most like us. We often hire people who are just like us, but those are not the people we need to really complement our strengths and our weaknesses. So we really need to be aware of, how are we listening? What are we rewarding? And what are we punishing? Like, are we rewarding the people who agree with us and punishing those who challenge us? That's setting a really bad tone. But often we aren't aware of that as leaders. And we fall into this trap of like, oh yeah, it made me really feel good because Becky just agreed with me. Of course I feel good if you agree with me. But Caroline just challenged me and that made me really uncomfortable. But maybe I really need to hear what Caroline just said. And so I'm going to have to calm down and actually be able to hear her. These are some of the ways I'm talking about when I say leaders set the tone. And unless they are, and I put myself in here, unless we are really self-aware, we send the wrong message. We may inadvertently send the wrong message. And so we do have to just get really in touch with, how am I showing up? What am I saying? What's my body language? What are my facial expressions when someone says something I don't like? All of these things send a message to the people around you. So it's important to be aware of them.
So a couple of things that you said, the biases that we all bring, and some of those are unconscious. And when we're thinking about how we might gravitate more naturally to people who are like us, there's a really powerful section in your book where you talk about like dealing with the other, and you talk about taking yourself through an exercise of adapting so that you can see someone who you view as an other as being more like you.
Yeah.
I wonder if you might be willing to share that with us. I thought that was such a standout section. So
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you like that. And this is not, again, I borrow a lot in my work. This is not stuff I made up. This is a great practice. The practice that you're referring to that I reference in the book is called the Just Like Me practice. And I learned about it. I'll actually give you a little bit of a backstory about how I learned about it. I write about this colleague in the book. I had a colleague I really struggled with. One of those colleagues you have to work with because you're on the same team and you just don't like. They rub you the wrong way. I rubbed him the wrong way. He rubbed me the wrong way. But we had to work together because our teams were very, very closely linked in terms of what we did. And it was so hard for me to even see him as a fellow human being. I saw him as a jerk, right? And I had labeled him. And I realized this is not useful. This is, we have to work together. I have to see him as a fellow human being. And I was reading about empathy. I was actually researching about empathy and reading everything I could. And I found this practice, and it's online everywhere. And I included it in the book, called the Just Like Me practice. And what it is to try to find common ground with the people you most struggle with. Right. And it's also about compassion. And so for this person, it's when I felt like we have nothing in common. You start with maybe the very highest level, which is that we are both human beings and we share, I think we share 99.3% of our DNA, right? Okay, there's a point in common. And then you can go down and say, just like me, this person has friends and family that they care about. And suddenly they're humanized, right? They're human. They're not just the jerk. They are human. And just like me, this was really important for me. Just like me, this person cares about their professional reputation. And I realized what we were both doing was reputation management. Like he was trying to look really good, and so was I, right? We had that in common. And suddenly I saw him in a much more compassionate light, and I could have empathy for what he was going through. And we did establish a better working relationship because of that. So I still have to practice that when people are rubbing me the wrong way. It's not like I'm perfect or Zen, but I do put these things into practice to help me see people as not other, but instead like me in some way.
And we have someone commenting in the chat that Michael has used this Just Like Me exercise. And it's one that I think is going to stick with me for a long time because it's such a powerful way of reframing and considering people in a different light. So I'm so glad you included that. One of the challenging things is to face discomfort in professional situations in order to build trust. So I'm wondering about what ideas you have for leaders who find themselves wanting to avoid those uncomfortable conversations or uncomfortable situations. Why is it so important for leaders to confront those uncomfortable situations?
Yeah. And we all, I mean, again, this is human nature. We all avoid the discomfort, right? It's like, and that's why I talk about going boldly towards the discomfort, because I think if we avoid it, I think there are many risks. One is that all the issues are there. We're just not addressing them, right? So it may be that, like, let's just take an example, something that's very common in workplaces is that women are not having an equitable experience as men, like they're not being treated the same way. And everyone knows about it. The women are talking about it. And it's not, if it's not being addressed, if we don't say, what are we going to do to make sure that women are listened to, that they're not interrupted, that they're paid equitably, if we don't talk about it, it just festers, it goes underground, and it becomes very insidious because people, there's a lot of gossip. Often when you as a leader don't confront the uncomfortable truths and have the hard conversations, there's gossip, there's a level of discontent, and people don't actually trust that they can bring the hard topics to you as a leader. And so if you're not willing to address them, no one's going to bring them to you. They're going to talk behind their backs. There's going to be, I always talk about the meeting after the meeting. If we don't have the real conversations in the room, what happens is you walk out of the room and then the gossip begins, and it's really destructive. I of course, in my many 30-year career, I participated in a lot of gossip, because it's so tempting when things are not being addressed. You go and say, like, how dysfunctional everything is. What really needs to happen if you're a leader is to get all of that out on the table and confront it. And no, you can't solve everything on day one, but you pick the most important things. And, like, one of the things that I have seen companies do, an example of this is, like, as I bring up the issue of women not being treated equitably, and, it goes for all underrepresented groups, is like, we don't pay people equitably. Like, women are paid less than men, and Black women are paid less than white women, and this sort of thing. You address that, you talk about it, you find the data, and you fix it. Right. But if it's not talked about, it's, people will leave the organization, people will be unhappy, and people will see you as a really weak leader who's not addressing the hard things. So I mean, it's not easy to go into these hard discussions and get challenged about all of your beliefs. But I think just by keeping an open mind, and also this idea of, no, I'm not going to be perfect, but I'm going to be willing to take that bold step of, like, having the hard conversation, listening to the really hard feedback about what's really going on. And then I'm going to decide what I can do about it. But if I don't have that information, and if I'm not willing to go there, things are going to go pretty badly, probably.
Well, so let's talk for a moment. One of my happy discoveries as I was reading your book was the chapter about psychological safety, which I think really maps to what we're talking about with creating space for these difficult conversations. And it was fun to land on that chapter after having supported your other book, a whole book about psychological safety. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what we need to do to create the space where people can tell us the truth. So you tell a story in the book about a situation in which you asked a question in a meeting and you faced a response that was shaming and humiliating. And so as we talk about the idea of facing uncomfortable situations, we have to be able to tell the truth or speak openly about our experiences at work. So can you share a bit more about what it means to create a psychologically safe environment and how that will help us to navigate work more effectively?
Yes. And of course, I had to include that chapter because I really believe that psychological safety is the foundation to inclusive cultures where everyone can fully participate and everyone can speak up. And so that story I told was an example of, the destruction of psychological safety. And the reason I told it was because it was something that impacted me in the most profound way, because I was publicly humiliated in front of like 100 of my peers by the most senior executive in the room, who said, ask me anything. And so why is this so important? I referenced it before. If you shut someone down, then you're sending the signal that you're not open to really being questioned. So why is it so important is that if you can instead, like, and I really tell this story in a lot of my work of what could you have done instead? What could that executive have done instead of, like, having a defensive reaction and then, really having an outburst at my question? If that person had said, whoa, and even, like, just taken a breath and said, you know what, Minette, that question just hit me hard and I need a moment to reflect on it. Or, Minette, I don't have a great answer, but I want to get back to you. That would have sent the signal to the room. Okay, one, this is not a perfect leader pretending to be perfect. Two, they actually are open to questions. And three, the next person is going to be willing to ask the question. What happens instead when that person lashed out at me and humiliated me? The room goes silent. And is anyone else going to raise their hand and ask a question after that? No, or not in any way a controversial question. They'll ask a very safe question that they probably already know the answer to because they don't want to be the next person to be publicly embarrassed or humiliated or shamed. And so, I mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but less extreme examples happen all the time. And if you're even in a small meeting with a group and, you speak up and you get talked over, for example, which happens a lot, like, just even if people are just being enthusiastic and talking over each other. But if you repeatedly get ignored, you start to feel that my voice is not welcome. No one really cares about what I have to say. And I'm just going to withdraw now. I'm going to sit back. I'm not going to try anymore. And the whole team loses out on that person's perspective. And so you as a leader, you probably tried to hire the best group of people, maybe the most diverse group of people. But unless you create those conditions where everyone's voice is respected and welcome, you're not going to really be able to leverage and tap into the talent you have around that table. So I could, of course, go on and on about this, and I could write another book about it. But anyway, I just believe it is so important and so fundamental to everything else that we build on.
That makes perfect sense, that it's impossible to help people feel included if they're not safe psychologically. So super powerful. So let's talk a little bit about listening. Because active listening can strengthen communication between leaders and members of their organization. So how have you experienced this on your journey?
Well, it's very funny because one of the first classes I ever took when I was like a first-time manager was a communication success skills class. And in that class, I learned about active listening. And at the time, it seemed really silly because they made us follow this formula, like, I hear you saying blah, blah, blah. And, you're basically parroting back. And I minimized it when I first learned about it because I thought, I'm not going to do that. That's just kind of ridiculous. And I think the reason I didn't like it is because it felt so formulaic. But years later, much further along in my management journey, I realized just how powerful it is to be listened to, because I would experience, like, even being in a one-on-one meeting with my manager and noticing that he was checking out and he wasn't really listening to what I had to say. Like, he'd be looking at his, text or phone or screen or something, and just feeling like he doesn't care what I have to say. And then when I was with someone who really listened and who's like, oh, I hear you, Minette. And like, even they didn't necessarily say, I hear you saying, but they demonstrated that they had heard what I said, like how much I felt valued in that moment. And I realized I have to be better at this too. So certainly I had to tame my own, tendency, which is so human, first of all, to get distracted. But second of all, what's so common is that we're actually preparing our response instead of listening to the other person. And we stop listening. So learning to just stay present with someone. And it was really, really interesting because the other day someone contacted me on LinkedIn and had seen me in a webinar and said, I noticed something you did that I really want to try. And I said, well, what was that? And she said, I saw that you listened to the end of the question and you reflected before you responded. And it's like, oh, I'm actually practicing what I'm teaching. Like, I've actually learned to do this, but it has taken me years. And I think many leaders are so, and it's part of the pressure of being a leader. And I know this is like, you're supposed to be quick on your feet. You're supposed to have an answer to everything. You're supposed to be able to respond to all the problems and have a solution. And so we get this in our heads and we stop listening and start solving instead of actually listening to the person in front of us. And really, the person in front of us wants to be heard before you solve anything. And so one of the practices I think is worth trying out, especially when you're in a one-on-one conversation with someone, is like, if someone's bringing you a problem, when I was a manager, I would say, I want to ask you first, do you want advice on this, or do you just want me to hear you out? And that would kind of set the tone of like, sometimes I want to be heard, right? And then we can solve it together, or not at all. I need to vent a little bit. But I think it's really empowering when a leader can do that. The other person is like, oh, I can ask for help, or I can just vent, or both, a little of both. Like I need to vent and I need advice. But it makes people feel like they're important and that you care about them. And I think, being cared about by a leader is just so precious and often so rare.
I'm wondering if you have any stories about times that you were listened to well, or that you really did sense the deep care of the person who is leading you, Minette.
Mm, for sure. And there's actually a story that I tell in the book, and it's not in the context necessarily of listening, but I think it showed that he was such a good listener. I talk about this manager I had for a while who had an idea about what we should do. And he was convinced. I talk about this story and in his ability to change his mind based on new information. But what I loved is that he truly listened when I pushed back on his idea. So he had this idea. I was doing a big reorg, and he said, we're going to go from like 30 project managers to 3, because there are 3 divisions in the company and they can be 1 project manager for each division. And I was like, oh my God, like, first of all, I knew that couldn't work just because I knew the workload. But I think I took some time. I didn't react in the moment. I think I took some time, and I came back to him and I said, this is what I would count my counter proposal is this. I don't think we can go to 3 for these reasons, but I think we can go to, and I forget what my number was.
12, I think it was.
12. I went to 12. And this is why. This is the workload that each of them would have. And he just listened. This is when I felt so listened to. He didn't feel like he needed to be right. He didn't feel like he had something to prove. He listened and he goes, yep, I see what you mean. Let's give that a try. And we did. And we went forward with that. I so appreciated, because often what I'd seen instead is leaders make a decision and they feel that it would diminish their authority to backtrack on a decision. And he instead was like, yeah, I think I understand where you're coming from. You've got more background than I do, right? He was acknowledging I had more expertise than he did because it was the team I was managing, and let's give your idea a try. That felt just like super affirming, and just respect also that he didn't know better than I did. I was a subject matter expert in things that he wasn't, and he was a subject matter expert in other things.
Yeah, that's a terrific story, and that one definitely stood out to me as I was reading the book. You know what? I'm gonna like go off track again. I want to talk about one thing about the book that I just adored as well that we haven't mentioned yet. So, at the very end of every chapter, what Minette has done is she has given readers a daily practice that they can try, a weekly practice that they can implement, and then some really amazing reflective questions. And that is just such a powerful thing as you might be on a journey to become a more boldly inclusive leader, or just a more human leader, to be able to tap into those questions as part of your day-to-day kind of wanting to improve as a person and a leader and a human. So I hope it's okay that I threw that in there, Minette, but
Oh yeah. And you know what? It's really interesting. I added those because this is what I feel about whether you read a book or you attend a workshop or you attend a keynote, is you get a bunch of new ideas, you may get inspired, and you close the book or you leave the workshop or the keynote and you kind of forget about it all. Like it fades, right? It fades pretty quickly. And I did not want this book to fade because I felt like there's so much work to do. I really do believe all of like great leadership is a practice. And so that's why I offered those ideas for like daily, weekly practices and questions to ask yourself. And I just created, in case anyone is interested in this, I just created a discussion guide based on some of those questions, so that if you want to use this in your teams, that you have some new resources.
so where can people get that? Just a sidebar commercial here.
Oh yeah, well, right now it is kind of hidden on my website, but they can reach out to me on my website and then I will get it to you. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, I would definitely want that. I almost want to take those daily practices and put them into like a little guide or on a note card on my desk or
Yeah,
something.
maybe I'll do that too. We need to think about that. Yeah.
So one of the things that stood out to me that I want to make sure we talk about is that you talk about to become a more human leader, you have to practice sharing not only your strengths, but also your flaws in the workplace. And, I've spent over the last week or so since I read that chapter time just thinking about, well, in what way do we share our flaws in the workplace? And how does that help us to become a more human leader? Could we talk for a few minutes about that, Minette?
Yes, and I know, Caroline and I wrote about this also in our first book, the playbook. And I truly believe this, that people trust leaders who show up with their strengths and their imperfections. And they don't, like, I don't trust someone who gets up there like, I am perfect in all ways and I know everything and I'm good at everything, because we know no human being is good at everything, right? And so the thing is, we see the flaws anyway. So why not have the leader be upfront about them? And so, like, one of the things that I learned pretty early on is what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. And I was, some of there are many things I'm not good at, including, like, I'm not really good at doing things visually. I am not really great at data, at what to do with data. And when I was leading large teams, data was really important. And I would get overwhelmed. And instead, what I would do is I would just say, I know many of you, my staff members, are really good at visualization, are really good at presenting data, and I'm going to need your help because this is not my strength. I got so much support because there were people on my team who were great at, presenting things visually, who were great at manipulating data in meaningful ways. And I could present it because I'm a good communicator. That's one of my strengths, but I was not good at doing all that other work. And people, I think, first of all, they want to help. When a leader asks for help, they're like eager to help. And second of all, they saw that, like, no, I'm not putting on this facade that I know everything and that I'm good at everything. And I think they respected me more, honestly. They saw that I was a human being, right? And then I could also help them at the things that I was better at. And so that give and take, I think, really enhances your brand as a leader rather than detracting from it.
So I'm curious about how you would apply this if you are coming in to a team and you're leading the team and it's a new team to you. So in what way would you approach this, Minette, in terms of being able to start strong in showing up in a human way with your strengths and your imperfections?
What I think what I would do if I were coming into a team new and fresh, I would really have a get to know all of us session, like with my staff. And I would ask everyone to share your superpowers
Mhm.
and share your flaws and things you need help with, because we as a team probably have all the skills we need to complement one another. So I'm going to come in and say, these are my superpowers. I'm really good at communicating. I'm really good at big picture thinking. I am not so good at doing things visually. I'm not so good at data, and I may not be great at all the details. And so this is where I'm going to need some help. And if everyone on your staff does the same thing, you can kind of map out, like, oh, who's good at what, who can help one another. And honestly, how you get cohesive teams is that people do help one another and they fill in with complementary skills. But instead, too often what happens is people are really reserved about the things they're bad at because they're afraid it's going to show them as weak or flawed or less than, and including the leaders and the members of their teams. And so we don't actually tap into the collective wisdom and strength and genius of the individuals in the team. So that's what I would do, is like, let's share our superpowers and the things where we need some help.
That sounds like a really fun exercise. So I'm curious, for those who are with us today, if you've experienced that in the workplace, the benefit of sharing your flaws and your strengths with others. If so, we'd love to hear that in the chat. And in just a few moments, we're going to take some questions from you. I'm sure you have some. But first, I do want to take a moment to let you know some important things related to the fact that today is Minette's launch day. So you might know, if you've been on one of our webinars before, that launch day is a really important day for an author who's wanting to get momentum with their work in the world. And so we want to invite you to take a few next steps as a result of being on today's webinar. So the Boldly Inclusive Leader is available at all major online retailers now. And we're going to put some links in the chat. If you haven't already picked up the book, you don't already have a copy, we would encourage you to order the Boldly Inclusive Leader today. And you may have colleagues, friends, or family members who might also benefit from the book. And so we would encourage you to think about who those might be and to get a copy for one of them. Now, you might be on the call today and you got an early copy from Minette. I did, and it's gorgeous because I have Minette signing it for me. Let me see. I don't know which page you signed it on. I was going to show everyone.
On the title page.
Aha, there we go. See, I have a beautiful signed copy. If you received an advanced copy of the book, we would encourage you to leave your Amazon review today or soon, as soon as you can. We noticed before the call that the book's already ranking as a hot new release in several categories, depending on which edition, the hardcover or the Kindle. And already there were 7 amazing Amazon reviews when we got on the call today. So we would love to see your Amazon reviews, which will help us get momentum in sharing this important message with others. And you can also find out more about Minette and her work in the world by visiting her website at minettenorman.com. I'm sure we have that in the chat as well. So I'm going to take a look and see if there are some questions. We would love to take your questions. One of our listeners is asking for the discussion guide link, but it sounds like maybe we don't. Oh, hooray. Okay.
Only for you on this webinar today.
You said it was hidden. This is a brand new thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. And it sounds like a couple of people have already gotten the book and ordered the book. So as you've been listening to today's conversation, what questions have been bubbling up for you? We would love the chance to answer them. And I do have a question that I'm going to ask while we're waiting to see if some come in. One of the things that shows up is that when we talk about inclusion, there are obviously some gaps. Some of us may have more power and authority. And I'm curious what ideas you have for people who do have power and authority, whether by their position or their status, what those leaders can do to ensure that others are included and make a difference for them.
Yeah, I have a very strong belief that when we have power and when we have privilege, we need to use that power and privilege for good and not just take it for granted and assume everyone else has it, because they don't. And so one of the things that, well, there's several things, and one of them is to mentor others, but not stop at mentoring, because mentoring, it's very interesting that a lot of people, women and people from underrepresented groups, are generally mentored a lot. Like, oh, we get tons of mentoring, but we don't get sponsorship. And what I mean by that is that if you have power and privilege, you don't just mentor behind closed doors, you get up and you publicly say, you know what, Becky's amazing and she needs to be in front of you. She needs to be on this panel, or she needs to be interviewed for this position. So we speak up and advocate for others who may not have the power or privilege we have. And then we also have to be allies and advocates and upstanders for when we see or hear something that is not inclusive or that is just not okay, that we don't turn our backs to it and walk away, but we call it out and we say, you know what, that is not the way we're going to talk to one another here, or that is not the way we're going to treat people here. And I am not going to stand by and just let that happen. So those are some of the ways, but I think it's really important that we not just, especially as we rise in leadership or as we have privilege in our own communities, that we don't just sit back and enjoy our own comfort, but instead try to do everything we can to help those who don't have the power and privilege that we have. And there are lots of ways to do that. And I think honestly, what made me a better leader and what made me so focused on inclusion was mentoring a ton of people, women and a lot of people from underrepresented minorities, and realize what they're experiencing that I didn't experience. And that opened my eyes to my own privilege and power, and what made me want to do everything I could to help and to contribute to making things more equitable.
That's super powerful. And I have a question here for you. So our listener is saying, I fully agree with you that self-awareness is key for great leadership. So how can busy leaders find time, make it a habit? So how do we anchor your great reflection questions in our everyday lives?
Well, it's true. Everyone's busy, and they often, this is what I've seen with even with clients of mine, that they say, like, we have our business priorities, and then sort of off to the side, we'll work on inclusive leadership or better culture. And so I think the first thing is really a mindset shift, that the business is not separate from the culture and the leadership, that if you want your business to thrive, you have to focus on these things. And yes, my book has, I don't know how many questions, probably 5 in each chapter. So they're probably 10 in each chapter. There are probably 100 questions in the book. You don't need to do all of them. You don't need to answer all of them. Pick one, pick two, and just say, like, every week I'm going to do one thing from one chapter, and I'm going to see where it leads. And, pick something that resonates for you, because not everything is going to resonate with everybody. So I think the first step is to understand that focusing on people, leadership, and on creating a great culture is not mutually exclusive with business results. And in fact, there's tons of data, which I'm not going to share with you, but there's tons of data that you can all find yourselves about more successful companies are ones with great cultures that are more diverse and more inclusive. So we know this, the data's there. So now what are you going to do about it? And I think pick something, anything, and work on it a little bit, and then see where it leads. And then what I find with my clients too is that they work on something, they make some progress and exposes maybe a new weakness or a new challenge, and then you work on the next challenge. And I think that's all part of the journey.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So you're talking about doing both at once, being able to focus on the priorities of the business as you focus on building the culture that you want. And that reminded me of another both and that stood out to me from your book that I want to highlight, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Page 83, for those of you who might be following along, you talk about how empathy and compassion can feel like liabilities to us if they get in the way of making sound business decisions, particularly when there might be a performance issue at play. So I wonder if you could talk about that, because as I was reading it, it made so much sense, but it's something that I've struggled with on my journey of, I want the empathy and the compassion to be bigger, and then that sometimes leads me to delay difficult decisions.
Yes, and you're not alone. I did the same. And I think that was something I actually learned through probably thinking I was being compassionate and empathetic and avoiding the decision. And instead, so here's an example of a performance issue that if there's a performance issue. So I remember once feeling like, I really want to try to make this person successful. I'm going to do everything in my power. I'm going to be empathetic. I'm going to be compassionate. And what I didn't realize I was doing is I was overemphasizing the empathy for the person who was underperforming. And instead, I was neglecting all of their team members who were suffering as a result of his poor performance. So I kind of missed the boat. Is like, the empathy and compassion has got to be for everybody, and it has to be for your whole organization. The business decision that I needed to make was to let this poor performer go in full support and empathy and compassion for those who were picking up the slack that this person was not delivering. So I think there's often a fine line we walk as leaders, like, how can I really be caring and genuinely empathetic and compassionate, and at the same time making tough decisions? And some of them may be even worse than letting an individual go. And I talk about how hard this is, doing layoffs, for example. Right? Like, I probably can't even tell you how many layoffs I had to do in my corporate career. And they're devastating, especially to someone like me who's highly sensitive. And they would be grueling for me. And yet, though, I had to do it. Like, I was given a number, right? And I had to make those cuts. And I still believe that even when you let someone go in a layoff situation, that you can still be compassionate towards them. You can still be empathetic while making those hard decisions and communicating those hard truths. You do not have to be an automaton. You do not have to completely shut down your emotions. You show up still as a human being. And again, that's a balancing act that I had to learn over the years. Like, I remember after my first layoff having to go in private and cry for a long time afterwards, because it was so devastating to me to do it. But I wasn't going to cry in front of the people I was laying off, because it was their emotions that were more important than mine, right?
Well, and you tell the story of one of your layoffs in the book. I wonder if you would share that story with us today. I thought it was excruciating to read about the situation that you were put in, but also there's like this happy ending.
Oh gosh, it's really funny you mentioned that story. I just had lunch with 3 of the people who were there during that. And I said, do you remember, I gave them a copy of the book, and I said, do you remember that day? And they're like, we will never forget that day. So briefly, the story is that I had to lay off, I don't know how many people, more than a dozen people, and none of them reported to me, because the head of the department decided she was going to leave the country and delegate the layoffs to me. And it was the first time I had ever laid people off, and I basically had to notify them one by one, very, very sorry to report your job's been eliminated. I mean, this one almost killed me. And then one of the women that I was laying off, I think I mentioned this in the book, was so compassionate to me. She said, Minette, I get that this is really hard for you too, which almost brought tears to my eyes. Like, here's the woman I'm laying off, and she's showing compassion for me. And afterwards, I then had to hold an all hands meeting for the whole department, which was quite large, and say, we've just done layoffs and we're notified, everyone's been notified. And those of you who haven't been notified, your jobs are safe. And it was a very tight-knit department. And so after the layoffs, the team wanted to go out to a big lunch and invite everyone who had been laid off, as well as everyone who was together. And I was like, oh, I'm staying far away from this. I am, I'm basically the Grim Reaper who laid them all off. And they're like, no, Minette, we want you to be there too, because you're a part of this group. And I'll never forget that lunch of, like, people were crying. They'd been people who had worked together for many years. And yet, they saw me as, this is the key, they saw me as a fellow human being. They didn't see me as like this automaton leader who came in with no feeling and laid them all off. And anyway, I just think that that was an important part of my growth too.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that story, Minette. Is so powerful. And I'm so glad that you wrote the book. So there's another question in the chat. And the person is wondering, are you still practicing just like me exercise on a regular basis?
That's a great question. And yes, and it's hard, it's sometimes hard. So I am not in an everyday work situation, so I don't have the thing with colleagues, but I actually practice it in my personal life. And sometimes it's just a reflection when I am othering people, because we all do, we label people. And right, I think Caroline put a comment in the chat earlier that when we label people, our empathy goes away. Like, it's just like neuroscience, that we put a label on them, like, politically, I disagree with them, they're horrible, they're stupid, whatever. And yet, I have to try to remember, and this is very hard sometimes, that we all are human. We all care about certain things in common, even if we completely disagree. So I try to do it regularly. I try to do it when I'm at my worst and I'm judging people, and I'm just as judgmental as everyone, if not more so. So I have to do this. I really have to practice just like me. And I try to do it, especially when I'm feeling challenged.
Thank you for that. So I'm just going to go one more time to our calls to action today. I hope that you're convinced, as I am, that this book has the power to make a big difference in helping to build a world of more inclusive and human leaders. We hope you will choose to order a copy once you've read the book. We hope you'll choose to leave an Amazon review. And if you haven't read the book yet, as soon as you have, one of the best ways that you can help expand awareness of this book to others is to leave that Amazon review. If you enjoyed today's event, we would encourage you to share it once you get the recording with your friends and colleagues on your social media channels. And I don't know if we have this link ready, but I'm sure that Minette would love it if you would follow her or connect with her on LinkedIn as well. I would always love to connect with you. We like to allow you all to connect in community with one another. So this would be a great time if you would like to put your LinkedIn link into the chat, so that others can connect with you and you can continue this conversation. Minette is one of the people that I admire the most in terms of how she shows up on LinkedIn. I've been watching her, ever since we started working together earlier this year. And I don't know if you're saving back the story at the end of your book from the afterword about LinkedIn and your learning there. I don't know if that's going to be your wrap-up story, but I kind of want you to share that with everybody.
Oh, I wasn't thinking about that. And it's funny, when I had to finish writing this book. Gosh, when did I finish writing it? Back last year, middle of last year. And so that was fresh news when I put that in the afterword. And now it feels so old, such old news, but I'm happy to share it if you'd like.
I want you to share it. And then, yeah, I would love it if you would share it. And I don't know if you had any other wrap up comments, but I feel like people would love that story.
Okay. Well, what the story that's in the afterword of the book is about going viral on LinkedIn. I've only gone viral on LinkedIn, where I got more than 1 million views once. And I think LinkedIn has actually changed their algorithm to discourage virality, which is interesting. I read that recently. So last June, what did I turn? I turned 62. It wasn't a milestone birthday or anything, but I had just gone out for my wonderful birthday celebration with my wonderful husband, Tom. And I had this compulsion to write publicly about celebrating being 62 because there is so much gendered ageism. And I felt like I need to be public about my age and not try to hide my age and actually talk about it because this is just near and dear to my heart. And so I wrote this really quick off the cuff post about like, here I am, I'm 62, I'm celebrating my birthday. I'm not hiding about it. And I feel like, I couldn't talk about this openly when I was still in the tech world. And now that I'm out on my own, having my own business, I feel like I need to be public about age and all the things that, seems to hold us back and seem to hold us back in the world of work. And that was it. It was a picture of me with a drink and a big smile on my face celebrating my birthday. And I got like, I don't know, 1.5 million views and like 25,000 likes and 2,000 comments. And it was just like, I was shocked by it. I didn't expect it to happen. And I was asking some of my friends, like, what was it about that post? Right. And they're like, it was honest, it was vulnerable, it was just real. And they're not, I mean, I think that has changed now on LinkedIn where people are showing up more that way, but last June apparently that was new. And I think the lesson for me is, for leadership or on social media or whatever it is if you show up as real and don't try to hide whatever it is you think you need to hide, people are going to respect you more, and they're going to see you as a leader, and they're going to see you as a human being, a fellow human being like them. And I think we need to not try to hide those flaws and imperfections or our age or whatever it is, and instead to celebrate them.
I just love that so much. Thank you for sharing that with us, Minette.
You're
Is there
welcome.
anything else you want to share as we wrap up this amazing hour with our listeners today? And congratulations to you. I hope that everyone will buy and recommend the book. It's so good.
Oh, thank you. I guess what I would wrap up with is kind of where we started, is that this is really about leading humans. And even if you don't think of yourself as like, I'm not about inclusivity, I'm not about diversity, equity, inclusion, if you have any interactions with other human beings, I think this book can be of use and of service, because it's really about interacting on a more human, compassionate level, and not seeing other people who are different from us as either less than or the enemy, but instead like fellow human beings. And we all have to figure out how to interact better together, whether in the workplace or even in our communities.
Thank you so much.